I stood at that podium in my black dress and pearls, holding the papers that would change everything. The church was packed, but all eyes were on the three strangers sitting in the front row where my family should have been. The woman had the nerve to dab her eyes with tissues like she was the grieving widow, while her two teenagers sat beside her looking bored. "Excuse me," I said into the microphone, my voice steady as steel. "Before we lay Clarence to rest, I think everyone here needs to know exactly who he really was." I unfolded the will with shaking hands. This is Clarence's last will and testament, which I'm sure some folks here are very interested in hearing. The woman in the front row, Rochelle, as I'd learned her name was, sat up straight. Her boy Terrence was suddenly paying attention. Even little Kendra stopped playing with her phone. "I, Clarence Washington, being of sound mind," I began reading, "leave my entire estate, including the house at 423 Maple Street, my savings of $340,000, and my life insurance policy of $500,000, to..." I paused and looked directly at Rochelle. "The American Cancer Society and the local food bank. Not one penny goes to any family members." The gasp that went through that church could have blown the roof clean off. Rochelle jumped up like someone had stuck her with a pin. "That's not right," she shouted. "He promised me and my babies everything. I've got the real will right here." I smiled and folded up my papers. "Honey, you might have some old paperwork, but this here is the will that's filed with the lawyer. Signed, sealed, and legal as the day is long." Before we continue, please drop a comment if you've ever experienced something like this. We'd love to hear your story and subscribe to the channel to help us grow. Now let me tell you how I got to that moment, because honey, it didn't happen overnight. Clarence and I had been married for 42 years. Met him when I was 23, working as a secretary at the insurance company downtown. He was this handsome salesman with the prettiest smile and the smoothest way of talking. Could charm the birds right out of the trees. We built a good life together in our little house on Maple Street. Clarence worked his way up to district manager, and I kept the books for 3 different Black-owned businesses in town. We went to Mount Olive Baptist every Sunday, had barbecues in the backyard, and I thought we were solid as a rock. But looking back now, I can see the signs. The late nights that got more frequent over the years. The business trips that seemed to last longer than they used to. The way he'd get secretive about his phone, always taking it with him to the bathroom or out to the garage when it rang. About 5 years ago, things started getting really strange. Clarence would disappear for whole weekends, claiming he had to visit some sick relative I'd never heard of. When I'd ask which relative, he'd get all vague and say it was some distant cousin on his mama's side. His mama had been dead for 20 years, and I knew every cousin she ever had. Then there were the credit card bills. Oh, those bills told a story all their own. Charges at fancy restaurants across town that we never went to. Shopping at children's clothing stores when we didn't have any grandkids. Movie theaters and amusement parks and pizza places that Clarence claimed were business expenses. The final straw came 6 months before he died. I was cleaning out his jacket pocket before taking it to the dry cleaners, and I found a Father's Day card. "To the best daddy ever," it said in a child's handwriting. "Love, Kendra." I confronted him that night after dinner, set the card right there on the kitchen table next to his coffee cup, and asked him who Kendra was. Clarence looked at that card like it was a rattlesnake. His face went 3 shades of pale, and he started stuttering about how it must have gotten mixed up with some papers from work. Said maybe it fell out of a colleague's briefcase or something equally ridiculous. But I wasn't born yesterday. I'd been keeping books and tracking numbers for 40 years. I knew when something didn't add up, so I did what any smart woman would do. I hired a private investigator. Best $2,000 I ever spent. Within 2 weeks, Detective Morris had pictures, addresses, and a timeline that made my head spin. Clarence had been living a double life for 15 years. 15 years! He had a whole other family on the east side of town. A woman named Rochelle Pierce and 2 kids, Terrence, who was 16, and Kendra, who was 13. The worst part? He'd been telling them that I was his sick sister who he had to take care of. That's why he couldn't leave me or marry Rochelle properly. Poor Rochelle thought she was being noble, sharing her man with his invalid sister out of the kindness of her heart. When I saw those photos of Clarence at Terrence's basketball games, coaching Little League with Kendra, taking family pictures at the zoo, something inside me just cracked wide open. Not broken. Cracked, like a dam that's been holding back a river for too long. I didn't confront him again. Instead, I got smart. I started documenting everything. Every lie, every fake business trip, every dollar he spent on his other family. I copied bank statements, saved credit card bills, and tracked every move he made. And then I called my lawyer. Clarence had no idea what was coming. He thought he was so clever, keeping his two worlds separate. He'd even convinced Rochelle that they were practically married in God's eyes, just waiting for the right time to make it official. When he had his heart attack 3 months ago, both families ended up at the same hospital. That was a sight to see. Rochelle burst through those emergency room doors, calling herself Mrs. Washington, demanding to see her husband. I was already there, having ridden in the ambulance, when this woman I'd never seen before came charging up to the nurses' station. "Excuse me," I said, walking right up to her. "I think there's been some confusion. I'm Mrs. Washington. I have been for 42 years. The look on that poor woman's face was something I'll never forget. Like someone had just told her the sky was actually green. She stood there with her mouth hanging open while her kids hid behind her, probably wondering who this strange lady was claiming to be married to their daddy. That's when Clarence's whole house of cards came tumbling down. Right there in the cardiac unit of General Hospital, with nurses and doctors trying to save his lying heart. Rochelle started crying and carrying on about how Clarence had promised to marry her as soon as his sick sister passed away. How they'd been planning their future together. How the kids called him daddy and everything. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then Terrence, that smart-mouthed 16-year-old, had the nerve to look me up and down and ask his mama, "Who is this old lady, and why is she lying about Daddy?" That's when my sympathy dried right up. Clarence pulled through that first heart attack, but the damage was done. Both families knew about each other now, and there was no putting that genie back in the bottle. He tried to play the middle, telling me he'd end things with Rochelle while promising her that he'd leave me for real this time. But I was done playing games. I'd already changed the will, moved money into accounts he didn't know about, and prepared for war. When he had the second heart attack 2 weeks later, the fatal one, I was ready. The funeral planning was a nightmare. Rochelle kept calling the funeral home trying to make arrangements, claiming she was his common-law wife. The kids were confused and hurt, not understanding why they couldn't sit in the front row with their daddy's family. Pastor Williams from Mount Olive tried to be diplomatic about it, but even he didn't know how to handle a situation like this. A man with 2 families, both claiming him, both grieving him, both expecting to bury him their way. That's when I made my decision. If Clarence wanted to live 2 lives, then he could have 2 funerals. But only one of them would be telling the truth. I let Rochelle and her kids sit in that front row. Let them think they were the real family, the important ones. Let them believe that when I read that will, they'd finally get what Clarence had promised them all those years. Standing at that podium, looking out at a church full of people who had no idea they'd been coming to the funeral of a man who'd been lying to everyone for decades, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Because finally, everyone was going to know exactly who Clarence Washington really was. And more importantly, they were going to know exactly who I was too. Not the sick sister. Not the obstacle to someone else's happiness. Not the fool who'd been played for 42 years. I was Vanessa Washington, and I was about to take back everything that was mine. The silence in that church lasted about 3 seconds before all hell broke loose. Rochelle was on her feet, waving a piece of paper in the air like it was on fire. "This is fraud!" she screamed. "That woman stole my husband's money. I've got the real will right here. Pastor Williams stepped up to the microphone, trying to restore order, but Rochelle wasn't having it. She pushed past the deacons and marched right up to the podium where I was standing. "You bitter old witch," she hissed, low enough that the microphone wouldn't pick it up. "Clarence told me all about you, how you've been bleeding him dry for years, pretending to be sicker than you are. Well, your little game is over now." I looked her dead in the eye and smiled. "Honey, the only game that's over is the one Clarence was playing on both of us. The difference is, I was smart enough to figure it out." That's when Terrence jumped up and started yelling about how his daddy had promised him money for college. Little Kendra was crying, asking her mama why the mean lady was being so cruel. The whole congregation was buzzing like a disturbed beehive. But I wasn't done yet. "Rochelle," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "since you want to wave that paper around, why don't you read it out loud? Let everyone hear what kind of promises Clarence was making." Her face went pale as a sheet. She clutched that paper to her chest like it contained state secrets. "That's what I thought," I continued, "because that paper isn't a will at all, is it? It's just another one of Clarence's lies, written on his computer at home. No lawyer's signature, no witnesses, no legal standing whatsoever." The funeral director finally got things calmed down enough for us to proceed with the service, but I could feel the tension crackling through that church like lightning. Half the congregation was staring at me like I'd grown a second head, and the other half was whispering behind their programs, trying to piece together what they'd just witnessed. After we laid Clarence in the ground, with both families standing on opposite sides of the grave like we were getting ready for a showdown, I went home to my empty house and poured myself a glass of the good wine I'd been saving. I was finally free, but freedom came with a price. Within a week, my phone was ringing off the hook. Rochelle had hired herself a lawyer, some bottom feeder who advertised on late-night TV, and they were threatening to contest everything. She was telling anyone who would listen that I'd manipulated a dying man and stolen his children's inheritance. The lies she was spreading around town were something else. According to Rochelle, I was some kind of master manipulator who'd been slowly poisoning Clarence's mind against his real family. She claimed I'd isolated him from his children and forced him to change his will while he was on his deathbed. The truth was, I'd changed that will 6 months before Clarence died, when he was still healthy as a horse and running between two families like some kind of marathon cheater. My lawyer, Harold Banks, a good man who'd been handling my business affairs for 20 years, called me into his office that Wednesday after the funeral. "Vanessa," he said, adjusting his glasses and spreading papers across his mahogany desk, "we need to talk about what you're up against here." Turned out, Rochelle's TV lawyer had filed papers claiming Clarence had been under undue influence when he signed the new will. They were arguing that as his wife of 42 years, I had somehow brainwashed him into cutting out his other children. "The problem," Harold explained, "is that while Clarence never legally married Rochelle, he did acknowledge those children financially. There are bank records showing regular support payments. He put Terrence on his health insurance. He claimed them both on his taxes for the past 5 years. I sat there listening to Harold outline their case, feeling my blood pressure rise with every word. These people, these strangers who'd been living off my husband's lies, were actually going to try to take my home, my savings, everything I'd worked for. "What are our chances?" I asked. Harold leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Honestly, it's going to be a fight. They can't prove undue influence, but they can make a case that Clarence had a moral obligation to provide for those children. A sympathetic judge might see things their way." That night, I called my sister Dolores down in Atlanta. Dolores was 10 years younger than me and sharp as a tack. She'd been a paralegal for 30 years before retiring. "Girl, what kind of mess has Clarence left you in?" she asked after I'd told her the whole story. "The expensive kind," I admitted. "His outside children are coming for everything, and their lawyer thinks he can paint me as the evil stepmother who manipulated a dying man." Dolores was quiet for a long moment. Then she started laughing. Not a happy laugh. The kind of laugh that meant somebody was about to get their feelings hurt. "Vanessa," she said, "do you remember what Mama used to tell us about dealing with bullies?" "Don't let them see you sweat," I recited automatically. "That's right. And what else?" I thought back to our childhood, to our mother's wisdom that had carried us through decades of challenges. Document everything and keep your receipts. Exactly. Now tell me, what kind of receipts do you have on this man's double life? I started listing everything I'd collected over the past 6 months. Bank statements showing how much money Clarence had been funneling to his other family. Photographs from the private investigator. Credit card bills from restaurants and stores across town. Phone records showing hundreds of calls and text messages. But the most damning evidence was something I'd discovered just 2 weeks before Clarence died. While cleaning out his home office, I'd found a notebook hidden behind his filing cabinet. In Clarence's own handwriting, he'd been keeping track of the lies he'd told each family, what stories he'd used to explain his absences, which relatives he'd claimed were sick or dying, even a schedule showing which family got which holidays. He wrote it all down, I told Dolores. Every lie, every excuse, every manipulation. It's like he needed a cheat sheet to keep his story straight. "Vanessa, honey," Dolores said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "You don't just have receipts, you've got the whole damn cash register." That's when I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Rochelle wasn't my enemy. She was just another one of Clarence's victims. Those children weren't trying to steal my money. They were just confused kids who'd lost the only father they'd ever known. But their lawyer? He was a different story altogether. The next morning, I drove across town to see Rochelle. She was living in a little rental house that Clarence had been paying for, according to my investigation. When I knocked on her door, she opened it with her hand on her hip and fire in her eyes. "What do you want?" she demanded. "To talk," I said simply. "Woman to woman, without lawyers or kids or anyone else sticking their noses in our business." She hesitated, then stepped aside to let me in. The house was neat and small, with pictures of Clarence everywhere. Pictures of him at Terrence's basketball games, helping Kendra with homework, playing board games at the kitchen table. Seeing him smile in those photos, looking genuinely happy with his other family, hurt worse than I wanted to admit. "He loved them," I said quietly. "Yes, he did," Rochelle replied, her voice softer now. "And he loved you too, in his way. He used to talk about how you'd been together since you were young, how you'd built a life together." We sat across from each other at her kitchen table, two women who'd loved the same lying man for very different reasons. "Rochelle," I said, "what did Clarence tell you about me?" She looked uncomfortable but answered honestly. "He said you were his sister, that you'd gotten sick when you were younger and never recovered properly, that you needed someone to take care of you and he was the only family you had left." I nodded. "And what did he tell you about your future together? That as soon as—" She paused, realizing how cruel it sounded. "As soon as you passed away, we'd get married for real. That the kids would finally be able to use his last name legally. That we'd move into the big house and live like a proper family. The house that I've been paying the mortgage on for 42 years, I said gently. That's when it hit her. Really hit her. Rochelle's eyes filled with tears as the full scope of Clarence's deception became clear. She hadn't just been his mistress, she'd been his mark. He'd convinced her to give him 15 years of her life, to raise his children in secret, to accept a relationship built on lies and false promises. "He never intended to marry you," I continued. "The notebook I found proves that. He was planning to keep both families indefinitely. You and the kids were his escape from responsibility, and I was his stability and financial security." Rochelle put her head in her hands and started crying. Not the angry, frustrated tears from the funeral, but the deep, heartbroken sobs of a woman who'd just realized her whole adult life had been built on quicksand. "What am I supposed to do now?" she whispered. "I gave him everything. I turned down other men who wanted to marry me because I thought I already had a husband. Those kids think their daddy was taken away by a mean old woman who hated them. That's when I made a decision that surprised even me. "Rochelle," I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "What if I told you there was a way for all of us to get what we really need?" She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean your lawyer is about to make a big mistake. He's going to try to paint this as a fight between two women over a dead man's money. But that's not what this is really about, is it?" She shook her head slowly. "This is about a man who lied to everyone who loved him. A man who stole 15 years from you and 42 years from me. A man who made promises he never intended to keep." I pulled out a manila folder I'd brought with me. Inside was a copy of Clarence's secret notebook, along with bank statements showing exactly how much money he'd spent maintaining his double life. "What if instead of fighting each other," I said, "we fought him?" Rochelle stared at the papers, her mouth falling open as she realized what she was looking at. "Tomorrow," I continued, "your lawyer is going to walk into that courtroom thinking he's got a simple inheritance dispute. He has no idea what kind of evidence I've been collecting. But here's the thing. I don't want to destroy you and those kids to protect myself. You've been hurt enough." "Then what do you want?" I smiled and leaned back in my chair. "I want the truth to come out. All of it. I want everyone to know exactly what kind of man Clarence Washington was. And then I want us to figure out how to move forward without letting his lies destroy the rest of our lives." Outside, I could hear Terrence and Kendra coming up the front steps, probably home from school. In a few minutes, they'd walk through that door expecting their mother to have good news about their daddy's will. Instead, they were about to learn that their entire world had been built on lies. But maybe, just maybe, we could build them something better. Something real this time. Something Clarence had never been able to give any of us. The truth. 3 weeks later, I walked into that courtroom wearing my best navy suit and the pearl necklace Clarence had given me for our 20th anniversary. Funny how those pearls felt different now, not like a gift from a loving husband, but like evidence of a lie that had lasted decades. Rochelle was sitting at the plaintiff's table with her TV lawyer, looking uncomfortable in a borrowed dress. We'd spent hours preparing for this day, going over every piece of evidence, every detail of Clarence's deception. The kids were in school. We'd both agreed they didn't need to see this particular show. Her lawyer, a slick-talking man named Peterson, who wore too much cologne and too many gold chains, had no idea what was coming. He'd spent weeks preparing for a simple inheritance dispute between a widow and a mistress. What he was about to get was something entirely different. Judge Martinez called the court to order, and Peterson jumped up like he'd been shot from a cannon. "Your Honor," he began, strutting around that courtroom like he owned it. "This is a clear case of an elderly woman manipulating a dying man to deprive his children of their rightful inheritance. My client, Ms. Pierce, was Mr. Washington's common-law wife for 15 years. Her children called him Daddy. He supported them financially and emotionally, and he promised them security after his death. Peterson painted a picture of me as some kind of scheming villain who'd stolen a dying man's money out of spite. According to him, I was a bitter old woman who couldn't stand the thought of Clarence's real family getting what they deserved." When he was done, my lawyer Harold stood up slowly. Harold had been practicing law for 35 years, and he knew how to work a courtroom like a master musician knows how to work his instrument. "Your Honor," Harold said, his voice calm and measured, "my client agrees with everything Mr. Peterson just said about the manipulation and deception in this case. The only thing he got wrong was who was doing the manipulating." That's when Harold opened his briefcase and pulled out Clarence's notebook. "What Mr. Peterson doesn't know," Harold continued, "is that the deceased, Clarence Washington, was a serial manipulator who spent 15 years lying to both families. We have documentation of every lie he told, written in his own handwriting. Peterson's face went white as Harold began reading from the notebook. Tell Rochelle I'm visiting sick Aunt Ruby this weekend. Tell Vanessa I'm at insurance conference in Birmingham. Take kids to zoo on Saturday. Tell Vanessa I'm playing golf. The courtroom was dead silent as Harold read entry after entry, lie after lie, manipulation after manipulation. Clarence had documented his deception like it was a business plan. But the real bombshell came when Harold presented the financial records. Your Honor, Mr. Washington wasn't just deceiving these women emotionally. He was committing financial fraud. He took out credit cards in his wife's name to pay for his second family. He forged her signature on loan documents. He even opened a college savings account for the Pierce children using Mrs. Washington's Social Security number. I watched Peterson's face crumble as he realized his client wasn't the victim he'd thought she was. She was evidence of the defendant's crimes. Judge Martinez leaned forward in her chair. Mrs. Washington, she said, you're telling this court that your husband stole your identity to support his other family? I stood up and looked directly at the judge. Yes, Your Honor, but that's not even the worst part. Harold handed me a folder, and I pulled out the bank statements that had taken me months to untangle. The worst part, I continued, is that while he was stealing from me to support them, he was stealing from them to maintain our lifestyle. He told Rochelle that I was his sick sister, and he convinced her to take out loans and credit cards to help support me. That woman has been paying for my groceries and house payments for 3 years, thinking she was helping her boyfriend take care of his invalid sister. The gasp that went through that courtroom was audible. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine. Rochelle stood up at the plaintiff's table, tears streaming down her face. Your Honor, she said, her voice shaking, I'd like to change my petition. Peterson tried to stop her, but Rochelle had heard enough. I don't want to fight Mrs. Washington anymore, she said. That man stole from both of us. He lied to both of us. And he left both of us to clean up his mess while he got to die thinking he was some kind of loving husband and father. Judge Martinez called a recess, and Peterson followed Rochelle out into the hallway, probably trying to talk her out of dropping the case. But Rochelle was done being manipulated by men in suits making promises they couldn't keep. When court reconvened an hour later, Rochelle had fired Peterson and was representing herself. Your Honor, she said, standing up at the plaintiff's table, I want to withdraw my claim against Mrs. Washington's inheritance. But I want to file a new claim against the estate for fraud and identity theft. That's when Judge Martinez did something I'll never forget. She smiled. Mrs. Pierce, she said, that's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. The next 2 hours were like watching 15 years of lies unravel in real time. The judge ordered a full investigation into Clarence's finances. She appointed a special administrator to untangle the web of fraud and forgery he'd created, and she made it clear that both Rochelle and I were victims who deserved restitution. But the real justice came when Judge Martinez addressed the courtroom directly. This case, she said, is a reminder that financial abuse and emotional manipulation don't just happen between strangers. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who claim to love us. Mrs. Washington and Mrs. Pierce both deserve better than what they got from this man. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Vindicated. But the story didn't end there. Over the next few months, the insurance fraud investigation revealed that Clarence had been running scams for years. He'd taken out multiple life insurance policies using false information, opened credit cards in dead people's names, and even filed fake tax returns claiming dependents who didn't exist. The insurance companies ended up paying out nearly $1 million in claims and penalties. Rochelle got enough money to pay off the debts Clarence had stuck her with and put both kids through college. I got my identity back, along with compensation for years of financial abuse. But more importantly, we got our dignity back. 6 months after the trial, Rochelle and I were sitting in my kitchen having coffee. The kids were upstairs doing homework. I'd invited them to stay with me while Rochelle looked for a bigger place to live with her settlement money. You know what's funny? Rochelle said, stirring sugar into her coffee. I spent 15 years waiting for that man to make me his wife. Turns out, the best thing he ever did for me was die, and let me find out who I really was without him. Terrence had started calling me Miss Vanessa and helping me with yard work on weekends. Kendra was teaching me how to use a smartphone and sending me funny videos that made me laugh. They weren't my grandchildren, but they were good kids who needed stable adults in their lives. The church community had rallied around both families once the truth came out. Pastor Williams preached a whole sermon about forgiveness and moving forward, and the congregation had embraced Rochelle and her children like they'd always been part of our church family. I'd also started volunteering at the women's shelter downtown, helping other women who'd been financially abused by men they trusted. Turns out, my experience with untangling Clarence's lies had given me skills that could help other people escape their own situations. 3 months ago, I got a letter from Detective Morris, the private investigator who'd first uncovered Clarence's double life. He was writing to tell me that my case had helped him solve 2 other fraud investigations involving men who were living double lives. Your courage in pursuing the truth, he wrote, helped protect other families from going through what you and Mrs. Pierce experienced. Last week I did something I never thought I'd do. I started dating again. His name is Walter, and he's a retired teacher who volunteers at the food bank. We met when I was dropping off donations from the church, and he asked me to coffee. Just coffee, he said. Nothing fancy. Walter knows my whole story. I told him everything on our second date, figuring it was better to get it all out in the open. His response was to reach across that restaurant table, take my hand, and say, "Vanessa, any woman strong enough to survive what you've been through is exactly the kind of woman I'd like to get to know better." I'm 73 years old, and I'm finally learning what it feels like to be with someone who tells the truth. Tonight, I'm sitting in my living room, the same living room where Clarence used to lie to me about where he'd been and who he'd been with. And I'm not angry anymore. I'm not bitter or hurt or confused. I'm free. Free to be honest about who I am and what I want. Free to build relationships based on truth instead of lies. Free to help other people who are trapped in situations like the one I escaped. Clarence thought he was so clever, keeping his 2 worlds separate, playing us against each other without us even knowing the other existed. He thought he could control our lives with lies and manipulation and false promises. But in the end, his lies brought me and Rochelle together. His deception helped us find our strength. His manipulation taught us to value honesty and authenticity in ways we never had before. The man who tried to destroy us with his lies ended up giving us the greatest gift of all, the truth about who we really are when we're not being defined by someone else's deception. And that, honey, is worth more than any inheritance could ever be. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.